The god's wood was never silent, not even in winter's deepest hour. Snow muffled the footfalls of man and beast, but the heart tree whispered still, its red leaves whispering without wind, its face half smiling at secrets it would never tell. Jon stood beneath its boughs with Ghost beside him, breath pluming, one hand on the pale, ridged bark. The wood felt warmer than it should. The old gods did as they pleased. "You're holding your breath," said Bran from the roots. Jon hadn't heard him move. The boy, no, not a boy any longer, though his voice was still the voice Jon remembered, was part of the tree and part of the snow and part of the lake-gray sky that pressed the world into quiet. Bran's eyes had gone a strange sea-glass green since he'd come home, pupils like pinpricks at the bottom of a clear, deep well, and when they fixed on Jon they seemed to see through clothes and skin and bone down into the ache that lived behind his ribs. "I am breathing," Jon said, and found that the words already tasted of sap. "You're breathing like a man," Bran said. "Try it like a tree." "What's that mean?" Jon asked. Bran frowned at him, faintly exasperated, like a master with a dull student. "Slow, through every bit of you, without hurry and without end." Ghost's ear twitched. He settled heavier by Jon's boot, a mound of white whose eyes were the only other bright color in the snowblind world. Jon eased the air out of himself, then pulled it back in the way he'd draw a rope, hand over hand, until he felt something. Not wind, exactly. Not the iron-on-tongue sweetness of snow. A steady rise inside the wood all around them. The long drink of roots, the soft circulative sap, an old patience that did not know fatigue. "There," Bran said softer. "Stay." Jon let his thoughts thin until they were thin enough to slide between bark ridges. The heart tree's face seemed closer. The carved eyes were pools of garnet. In their reflection he saw himself standing beneath the tree and saw Ghost beside him and saw, impossibly, saw leaves opening and closing like mouths. The sound that followed was not a sound, but he heard it. The steady drum beneath earth and stone. The beat that moved moon on tide and tide on shore. The deep heart of the north. And then, as simply as a hand finding a glove, the gods would claim him. He was the bark and the blood beneath it. The snow on his hair was his own leaves powdered white. The fish that lived beneath the ice lid of the pool flicked shadows on his underside. A beetle crawled in his cambium and tasted of wine and iron. Footfall. He knew the thud of man and the whisper of squirrel and the careful, cunning tread of a cat. He knew. He knew the old faces that had stood where he stood now, and heard their promises, and felt the mark of their knives when the lips had been carved. And he knew too the wrongness left by recent fire, a far-off place that stung like a healed-over burn on a stump, a god's wood wound. When he came back into himself he fell to a knee, not from pain but from the crash of returning. He caught himself on the roots, and the roots were ribs. Ghost's cold nose was at his ear, and the tongue that touched him afterward was warmer than any hearth. Bran sat watching him, the expression in his face that same patient brightness. "It's easier for you than most," he said. "You were always half wolf, half snow, half shadow." "I don't know that it's easier," Jon managed, standing. He felt a tremor in his arms and hid it. The tremor stopped when he put his hand back on the tree. "But I can touch it." "Good." Bran's attention shifted toward the opening in the wall of leaves where the stone path led back to the keep. "She's coming." "She?" Jon turned, already knowing, as if the leaves themselves had whispered the name. Arya moved like the wind that steals the last candle. No rattle of steel, no creak of leather. She was almost to them before Jon saw her, and he saw her before he knew he'd seen her at all, the way you see a thought you didn't know you had. She stepped out of dappled shade where none should be and smiled in a way that put every bone of his boyhood back in order. "Ghost," she said first, and knelt to hug the wolf. Ghost endured it the way he endured rain. Then Arya stood, and Jon took her, and for an instant he felt every road she had walked, dusty with summer drought and slick with canal water and spattered with the red of other people's lives. She was narrower than he remembered and stronger. Her eyes were bright with something that wasn't light. "Nice of you to wait." By the hearth, Ser Davos stood as if he had sailed into the room and was still eating his legs. At the window, a woman Jon didn't know watched the courtyard with the wary interest of a cat. Lean, long-limbed, her hair bound close to her scalp with thin cords dyed green and brown. A Cranagwoman by her clothes. "Desera Reed," Sansa said, following Jon's glance. "She's Howland's niece. She arrived with news from the Neck." Sansa's hands were steady on the edge of the table. Another heart tree burned. The words sank like an iron weight into Jon's gut, the place Bran's breathing had found earlier. He leaned forward before he meant to. "Where?" "Near Barrowton," Davos said, his mouth pinched. "A small hamlet, no name on any chart I've seen, which is most of them. Someone slipped down from the King's Road in the night, doused the trunk with something foul, and set it alight. The villagers put it out, but not before the face was ruined. And one man dead. Carver they had. The women say he would go to the heart tree to sharpen his chisel and speak to it before the work. He was found with his mouth full of ash. Arya's hands were in her sleeves, hidden. Her shoulders had gone still the way her shoulders went just before she moved. "Who?" "No one saw," Sansa said, and there was a hardness in the words that Jon had heard before in their father. She set her palm on a parchment with a sketch of a 7-pointed star burned into wood. The artist had pressed the point of his charcoal so hard the page had torn. "They left this, and this coin under the ash in the snow." "Davos." He came forward and set a small disc on the table. Jon knew it at once. The iron was dark with age, and the face stamped into it wore no face at all. A smooth oval that light slid off. On the reverse, the outline of a hooded man melting into a crowd. Arya didn't move, but something in her stilled further. "Bravos," she said evenly. "The House of Black and White?" Jon asked, quiet. "No house speaks for all bravos," Davos said. "But there are men who'll say prayers there when they want someone never to see another dawn. And men who'll leave coins." He did not look at Arya, and Jon was grateful for that. Sansa's eyes were on Jon now. They were not pleading. They were a queen's eyes, a lady's every inch, though the crown on her head was made of snow and not gold. "I will not have a war with the South over faith," she said. "But I will not have my people's gods mocked and burned, either. Not at my gates. Not beyond them. This will end quietly or it will end in spears." Her mouth thinned. "I would prefer the former." "You want us to find them," Jon said. "I want you to do what you were born for," Sansa said. Then softer, "What we were made for, whatever making is." Her gaze slid to Arya only briefly and then to Bran. The air in the room felt like the moment before snow slides from a roof. "I trust you. I will not ask what I do not need to know. But I will ask this, that you protect the gods." Jon looked at the coin. Arya did not. Bran was studying the apple in the bowl on the windowsill as if it were a map. Desera Reed's eyes weighed them without hurry. Jon felt the old oath in him, the one he had said wearing black, and the older oath under that, the one he had not said with his mouth but had been born knowing. The heart tree's face had bent closer. It was either the time to step forward or the time to step back. There was no time anymore for standing still. Jon said, "We'll go." They did not go with banners. At dusk they were gone. In the yard before the east gate, Desera Reed moved like water does when it decides to be a rope. She showed Arya a knot Jon had never seen, the slick-corded loops vanishing into themselves. And then she showed Jon how to take a willow twig and smear it with a paste she carried in an earthenware jar until the twig smelled like swamp and shade. "Cut a fresh wand," she said. "Moor your mind to it, if your mind is fool enough to float away. It happens out there." Her voice was soft as mud on reed stems. "The Neck is all drift. You need anchors." Bran smiled at that and handed Jon a wand without looking. "Try not to get lost." "I have you," Jon said. "You have the trees." Bran met his eyes, humor there, and something more thoughtful behind it. "And Ghost. And Arya. Leave me out of it." It was a moonless night when they slipped down the King's Road and cut across old paths toward Barrowton. Jon took 4 men and 1 woman from among the sworn, quiet, watchful ones who kept their blades wrapped and their cloaks the color of earth. Willem Ryswell's younger son with a face like a stone outcrop. a silent Manderly cousin whose belly had grown smaller since winter had ended and whose gaze never did. A spear wife from Hardhome named Halla who moved the way snow travels downhill. A man who had been in the watch once and kept his word still. A boy who had never made a vow to anyone but had a talent for vanishing in plain sight. Arya tested each briefly with a walk down the winter town street. By the time they reached the first ruin, they were a shape people did not notice. That would have been a comfort if it had not chilled Jon, who remembered being noticed and finding comfort in it. A brother's rough hand on his shoulder, a lord's nod across a hall. The burned godswood was smaller than Winterfell's, a cluster of old trunks around a heart tree no taller than a watchtower. Its face once a gentle, lopsided thing that probably looked like the woman who had carved it. Now the eyes had been cauterized into black pits. The mouth was a crack through char. The snow around it was gray with ash. Halla stood with her hands on her hips and her mouth flat in a way Jon had learned meant grief. Willem Ryswell's son stood with his jaw set and his eyes gone far away. Desera Reed knelt and touched the ash with her finger, smeared it between thumb and forefinger, brought it to her nose. She did the same with the damaged bark, gentler than a mother on a baby's cheek. Oil, she said, but not calf. Fat, something they cooked. Coal tar, maybe. There's pitch. And more. Her face tightened. A sharp tang. Alchemy's piss. I've smelled it once before in the south. In the cities. They build lights that burn forever sometimes. This is what they feed the wicks. The faces are ruined, the boy whispered. Jon had not heard him come up behind him. He was little more than a shadow wrapped in a cloak the color of dawn fog, but he had gotten across the clearing without rustling a leaf. Arya gave him the briefest glance that was not quite approval. Can you fix one? No, Bran said distantly, and all of them turned though none of them had felt him arrive. Of course he had not arrived. He was in Winterfell, with a hand on the heart tree and his mind among these trees. His voice rode the wind. No one else flinched. They had been warned. Faces change, he added, with a note in his voice like water tipping over stone. It's their way, but the scar will stay. Arya's face stayed smooth at that, but Jon saw her hand close inside her sleeve. The house that had taught her to wear faces thought them less than masks. A face was a device and a death. Here they were more. His sister lived between those truths. He wished again, with sharp, useless longing, that he could give her back something that had been taken, and he knew he could not. He forced himself to look for what might be found. Tracks, first. Sansa's caution had become habit. Minds as quiet as footfalls, movements that did not disturb the world more than necessary. Jon and Halla and Willem's son spread out, circling wide through the outer ring of beeches and the tangle of young elm. Ghost went ahead and came back. His mouth shut and his eyes tilted to Jon in a way that spoke of many feet and not enough scent. Oil stinks covers men as well. There were smears of it along the path that led down to the brook. At the water they found a better spoor. Whatever had come heavy. The bank was trampled, the pebbles pressed into mud, reeds broken at an angle any hunter would spot. The prints were booted, not moccasin. Jon crouched beside one where a boot heel had slipped on ice and caught again. He set his own foot beside it. The heel was cut with a double notch, and the sole was a pattern of chevrons he did not know. He reached down and touched the mud. Grit stuck to his fingers, crushed shell and something else. A fine powder that glittered faintly in the starlight. Mika. Halla, he said low. Have you seen boots like this? She came, looked, shook her head once. Free folk wear fur and hobnails if they're rich. River men leather and rope. Southron soldiers sometimes get fancy, she said, and squinted. That's not a soldier. That's a mariner. Dok boots. Good work. White Harbor or further. The Manderly cousin was kneeling at the water downstream, where a reed bed would hide a boat from the Godswood's sight. No skiff here, he said. His voice was thin, wheezing a little. A cough on cold nights rattled him. But they pulled something heavy this way. Drag marks in the silt. Casks, I'd wager, from the smooth roll between the grooves. Pitch on the sides might hide the stink. He spat. Bastards! Where would you hide casks in winter? Arya asked no one in particular. On water.
Oui, la messe sont grintedas.
The boy cocked his head, thinking. Desera Reed's eyes had gone unfocused as they did when she was laying reeds in her mind in some pattern John could not see. White Harbor, John said, and felt Sansa's map spread within his skull like a lit parchment. They would want a ship big enough to carry more. They would want to pass as legitimate. They would want it to be quiet. He pictured the wolf's den in his mind and the piers below the merman's court and the long, loud wharf where ropers and sailmakers shouted in the salt stink and the fish still wriggled in the boats. We go to the sea. They cut south and east by night, sleeping by day in copses and the lee of old stones. For the first 2 nights Bran's voice came to them on the wind, brief as the flick of raven wings, a caution about a patrol on the road, a warning that the hill beyond the hedgerow was not empty, the dry, unreadable announcement that there would be rain before dawn. On the 3rd night there was no voice at all. John did not wake to it and he did not sleep waiting for it. He slept watching the flash of a dream that had not the feel of his own. A chain of light floating on dark water, each link a bell struck with a bare finger. The sound was like a whisper that had hands. They came into White Harbor by the back of it, slipping down past the old fisher's lane where the nets hung like ghosts and the children sat with their toes just off the ice to dare each other. John had not meant to return so soon to a city he half loved and half feared. The Merman's Court was a place that could charm a man out of a year's patience and a month's plan. It had charm and power and a belly that felt bottomless some days. He couldn't tell the smell of wood smoke from the smell of fried eel, and in the alleys there were always 2 steps between humor and harm. He put his head down and walked and wore a dockman's coat he had stolen from a peg outside a tavern where no one would miss it. Arya walked beside him wearing a different woman's face. John had not asked and Arya had not offered, but when they made camp the night before she had taken the thin bundle from her sack and unwrapped it with hands as careful as those of a mason lifting glass, she set the face on her lap like a thing you do not name. Not a face at all without the rest, just a thin, heavy, damp canvas that looked too much like flesh. John had tasted iron in his mouth just looking at it. Arya's eyes had found his steady. She wanted to go, she had said in a voice that belonged to no one they knew. The last thing she said was, "Let me be useful. This way she is. This way I am." John had not asked whether that was true. He could not decide if he was glad of the face or heartsick over it, and nothing good lay between those feelings. He put his hand on Ghost's back and Ghost's heartbeat went through his fingers, steady, unjudging. He had found strength in the oaths he had made and the men who had stood beside him. There were new oaths now. There were new needs. He tied himself to the willow wand Desera Reed had given him and wished the wand were enough. They found the casks where they expected them, stacked 4 high in a warehouse that smelled like turnip and salt cod and not like pitch at all. The smuggler who had built the false wall had been a craftsman and a coward both. Desera found the latch with her eyes closed. The boy did not need it. He slipped through a gap John could not fit his wrist in and came back with a splinter that he put on John's palm like an offering. It was green in the center, and it stung his skin when it lay there too long. Arya watched him without watching him. Willem's son stayed by the door with Halla. The Manderly cousin put his ear to the casks one by one and listened. His ear pressed to wood as if hearing a whale speak. Davos had told John once that a good mariner could tell the sea's mood by the way a plank talked under his boots. The cousin's lips pressed into a line after the 4th cask. "Not oil," he said, grim. "Or not only. I know the feel of a good flame's feed by the swill. This is heavier. This has hunger in it." "Wildfire," John said, though he had not seen it since the Night King's landing had lit itself like an evil star. A thing out of the south and out of old men's bedtime stories. Fire as a beast that wanted and would not stop wanting. "Who?" He didn't expect an answer. He got a shadow's whisper. "Hard to say who," Arya said. "Easy to say who would. Those who hate old things. Those who buy death for coin. Those who are afraid." "Afraid of what?" Halla asked. "Afraid of what they cannot see through," Arya said, quiet. They were not alone in the warehouse. John knew it before the shadow moved because Ghost's hackles rose and the air tasted like steel. He dropped and rolled, and the knife that would have been in his heart tore a rent in the coat instead. The man who held it was short, compact, his hands held like a dancer's. He was balanced already for the next blow. Willem's son stepped to guard the door with a clunk of his back. Halla's spear was in her hand before John had finished turning. The boy was not where he had been. Desera Reed had vanished. The Manderley cousin was too slow to be anything but exactly where he was needed. Between two casks when a third man stepped out of the shadow with a torch that bloomed blue-green before the air could say no. "Do not," the cousin said, and put his blade in the man's throat. He turned back to John with tired eyes. "Forgive me, I prefer to talk." John had a blade in his hand and the weight of a second man on the blade. The man hissed, and the hiss was not like any Northman's sound. There was something in the shape of his mouth under the scarf that made John think of a different sea than the bite. The man spit a word in a language that bit like pepper, and kicked. John went back into a cask. His shoulder sang. Ghost came low and fast, silent, and took the man at the calf. He fell without crying out. He did not move again. The last man had Arya's knife at his ribs. He had gone as soft as a bag of grain the instant she touched him, as if the blade had pressed him asleep. His eyes were calm. They were also very empty. John crouched. "Who pays you?" The man looked at him as if he had asked what color the sky was and why should that matter. "All men pay." "They do," Arya said softly, "but some pay more." She slid the point just enough to make a sound like a breath. "The coin. Show him." The man's mouth stayed smooth. The eyes flinched the tiniest flinch. Arya saw it. Of course she did. She breathed, and with it her face changed about as much as a leaf does when wind shifts. She became, for an instant, a person John could not name but had seen in Bravos somewhere in a canal lot. A woman who sold eels and knives both. The man's breath caught. He had not expected the face to be an eel seller. He had expected something else. John smiled without humor. The faceless men were like all men who did things with ritual and shadow. They wrapped power in mystery and forgot what power was for. "It doesn't have to be a song," Arya said. "It can be a whisper. Tell me where you take the casks, and to whom." The man moved his eyes, not his head. He looked toward the harbor, toward the way the tide went out. "To a ship," he said, and that was not enough to save him and probably not enough to damn him. "To Prentice Bell." "Name of a ship," Davos said in John's memory. John almost heard the old smuggler's chuckle. "Ships named like men name their dogs. First thing they see, first thing they fear, first thing that bit them." "Out of where?" John asked. "Old Town," the man said, and it felt heavy, as if he had said, "Out of a room with books, out of a place that forgot the smell of blood on snow." Arya's eyes changed a fraction, looking past John toward Bran. Though Bran was not there, John felt Bran anyway. The coin in his belt warmed. He could not say how he knew it was there. He had not put it there. "Who waits in Old Town?" Arya asked. "The Bound Star," the man said. He smiled then, as if he had said a prayer. "They have taken off their mail to kneel. They have washed their hands. They have made a promise to bind old to new, wood to light. It is a good promise," he added, as if trying to convince himself. "Where do they go with this?" John gestured toward the casks. "To the lake with a face," the man said dreamily. "So said the one with the chain around his throat. He said the bells must be rung and the old faces must burn so that the old lies will end. He said we would be forgiven." "What chain?" John asked. "Black iron wit. H. Copper," the man said. "A mask of the same." He smelled of fennel and old vellum. He said the word craft, and made it sound like gospel. "An archmaester," said the Manderley cousin, flat. "If not one, then kin to. The ring and the rod and the mask are for their art." John had never been to the Citadel, but he had held a broken link from a maester's chain and known it had weight. He thought of men with mind for knowing all things and hearts for knowing only what could be placed in a shelved room. He thought of men who would like to put the old gods in a book and shut the cover tight. Arya sighed. and in the sigh was tired humor that did not forgive. Old Town is a long way, she said. There are other shores between. The neck, the green fork, the isle. She and Jon looked at each other because the isle had been in both their heads since Bran had said nothing about a dream that had bells in it. We go to Howland, Jon said. They left White Harbor the way they came and left it cleaner than they found it. The casks of wildfire were casks of lamp oil by the time they were done, thighs aching from the weight of water carried, clothes stinking of jellied pitch, palms blistered under gloves. Arya's smile wicked when Halla flung the empty jar into the harbor and the jar sang like a bell before it sank. The dead men in the warehouse were not there when the watch came by at first light, and no watchman would ever find them. Desera encoded the warehouse's crime in reeds and silt, a message delivered to Manderley by a fisherman's daughter who would remember it as a song she had once heard in the cradle. Howland will not like this, Desera said on the march south. He does not like war. He does not like cities. He does not like men who eat with knives. Does he like us? Arya said, amused. He liked your father, Desera said, and for a moment the marshwoman sounded older than she looked, older even than Howland should be. She tilted her head so the cords on her hair caught light. He will like that you bring the trees something they can use. How do you use trees? The boy asked, eager. Same as any other old thing, Davos's voice said in Jon's memory. You don't. You ask. In the neck the world narrowed and softened and swallowed sound. The reeds stood in their hundreds of thousands in green armies that whispered at the slightest breath. The ground beneath Jon's boots would be firm a moment, then sigh, then give, then firm again. They moved by signs Jon did not see, following birds that were not birds and stones that were not stones. Stars were brighter here because the world was nearer. Fog spread like breath and drew back like lips, as if the swamp were watching them as carefully as they watched it. Ghost vanished and appeared in a rhythm that felt like the beating of Jon's heart, and that was not comfort either. Desera did not get lost. She reached out with her willow wand and touched Jon's shoulder when he began to lean where there was no ground. Arya never leaned. Howland Reed's hall was where it always was and where it never was. Jon tried not to blink when it appeared among the willows like the thought of supper appears near sundown. It was long and low and roofed in living thatch, hummocked into the land as if it had grown out of it. It smelled like peat and fish and the sweet rot of things that become other things. He remembered a small man with a spear standing ankle-deep in green water that had more sky than any mountain ever could. He remembered his father's voice telling him that honor is a question you must ask yourself and no one else can hear the answer. He had not known he had remembered. Howland came out to meet them with half a dozen crannogmen at his back and a pale girl at his side. He was shorter than Jon and had eyes the color of the places between reeds. He did not seem particularly young or old. He looked like water when it turns to iron under the wind's hand. The pale girl's hair was damp to her shoulders, and her gaze was sharp as a fishbone. She had a frog spear in her hand. Jon saw the way she took Arya in at a glance and filed that away. The crannogmen wore mud and patience. They looked like men who would step into a story only to tweak its nose. Howland, Jon said, and did not know why his voice had softened. We bring trouble. Howland's mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile and might have been a grimace. Then you're home, he said. Supper first. Troubles second. Troubles last as well, I expect. After the stew of eel and onions and something that had the chalky pleasantness of lily root, they laid the trouble on the table. Desera set her reed bundles down and unrolled them, and the reeds made a map when you looked twice. The casks, the warehouse, the coin, the burned tree, the ship Prentice Bell out of Old Town, the bound star that knelt to make men stand. Howland's fingers brushed over the green map. They planned to burn the isle, he said, without making it a question. He did not look at Bran where Bran was not. He did not look at Jon's sword either. He looked at the stars as they would appear in 3 nights and said, almost idly, "The green men will not be easy to kill." "Are they men?" Halla asked, blunt. "They are old," Howland said. "Old things wear names you can use if you want to speak to them. Men is one. Green is another." He tapped a reed in the place where the green fork met the trident. If I were a bound fool and wanted to move fire quietly, I would go down these waters under cover with help in every village. I could not get to the isle by ship from Old Town. I would disguise my tools as something else. I would hide my zeal beneath other men's faith. He looked toward Desera. Is there a boat that slips where we do not look? A crew that does not drink when pay runs out? Desera had a coaster's whistle and a far-seeing's eyes. A black boat, she said, low with a green trim beneath the gunwale. No banner. Remo. VS at night and against the tide. Self-important, Howland said. And hungry. We will meet it. The ambush was not dignified because the neck did not care for dignity. It was reed beds and patience, and a rope of lilies stretched from bank to bank anchored to a log that looked like mere detritus until a hand moved under it. It was fireflies disguised as a pattern crannogmen recognized when they wanted to. It was a marsh call that sounded like a night heron but was not, repeated twice and then once again. It was a frog spear for a man trying to cut a rope and a soft laugh from Arya when the man fell into silt up to his neck and tried to claw his way out and realized the mud wanted him as much as any lover ever had. It was the split, quiet cry of a man whose calf muscle came away when Ghost pulled. It was Jon on the prow of a stolen skiff with his weight balanced and his blade low, because a blade high is a blade that promises something and a blade low is one that tells the truth. They took the boat. They took 3 men alive and 2 dead and 1 who might be either. The boat's hold held casks that smelled like lamp oil and sang like a viper's nest. Willem's son hammered a bung in and it sizzled. The captain had a tattoo of a star on his wrist, 7-pointed. The points run together in an unholy knot. Where do you go? Jon asked him. The man shifted his mouth. To the lake, he said, and then sighed, as if a weight had lifted. I don't care. I wanted to be paid. I wanted to be safe. These men. They speak like the gods do when they want you to hand them your spear. The rest is just lies with lights on. Arya's eyes were night itself. Who tells them what to say? A man with a chain across his throat, the captain said, and a priest with rings in his ears, and a woman with a shaved head and eyes like a dead cat's, and another man who never shows his face. I did not ask their names. You did not need to, Arya said. I know the one without a face. She asked no more of the captain. Jon didn't either. He had a name he would not speak aloud, not even to Arya, because to speak it was to admit the shape of the wind when it came off Bravos. When the reed boat had been burned and the black boat sunk so deep it would be fish chisels by dawn, Jon took Bran's silence in his hand and pressed. The dream that came to him that night was not his and was. The lake was a great eye with lashes of willow trailing into it. For a moment he saw a tower on fire, flames going up through its crown without consuming it. Then he saw bells in a chain, close enough to touch and cold enough to burn. Then he saw a hall with many doors, none of them meant for doors, all of them carved into the shapes of faces. He heard laughter that was a bird's and a boy's and a man's who had waited too long to be old. He smelled vellum, bitter and old and full of vanity. He saw a hand with too many rings set a green candle in a cup. The candle burned back on the hand. The hand did not move. When he woke, Arya was standing on the little hummock beyond their camp, her shoulders sharp under her cloak. The fog roped across the marsh in white snakes. Jon went to her. She did not look at him. They won't stop with the Isle, she said very low. If they succeed, they will go to all the gods' woods, then to Winterfell, then to the tree there. They do not understand that burning faces is like burning a field, but they will not need to understand. They will do it because they can and because someone told them it would make them safe. Jon wanted to tell her that they would stop them. He had never liked telling anyone anything he could not guarantee. We'll go first, he said. We'll meet them on the lake. We'll stop them there. How many? She asked. As many as it takes, Jon said, and heard his father in his mouth. A boy had once stood in a yard and sworn an oath he could not keep. This was not that. This felt like something else, something old and simple. The marsh's breath was on his skin. Arya, he said and hesitated. The face she wore tonight was not the one she had worn in the warehouse. It did not matter. The face beneath was hers, and that was what mattered. "If we do this," he said, because he did not like to say if. "When we do this, it does not end. Men who want to burn what they fear do not become men who love. They become men who learn new things to burn." Arya's laugh was a scrap of paper in a wind. "Who are you, Jon Snow?" she asked with fond exasperation. "A man who finally learned how to use his eyes?" She turned then, and her face was hers, exactly as it had been the day she had stolen his last piece of bread. "We do not need it to end. We need to be very good at it not ending." He thought of Sansa in her solar, and of Bran listening to apples, and of the hiss a bung makes when a green fire stops being able to breathe. He thought of Ghost's weight against his leg in the Godswood. He thought of Howland Reed and a tower and a secret he had demanded and had been given and had made him another man, because truth is not a thing you can swallow and keep down. He set his teeth. "We will be," he said. They waited a day. It was long enough for the Bound Star's next quiet shipment to realize its boat had not arrived on time, and long enough for the currents at the edge of the Green Fork to bring new whisperers to the bank. Riverfolk asking if anyone had seen what they had not seen. It was long enough for Bran to send them the sound of bells 3 times in the hour before dawn without sending them any of the sleep that should have accompanied it. The lake was bigger than Jon's mind wanted to remember. God's eye held sky like a mirror that had learned the trick of depth, hiding a round of black that felt more like the pupil of a thing than the thing itself. They made their way along the reed beds in skiffs with reeds laid across their laps to look like more reeds, because that was a Cranagman's way of doing it. Engineer. They put frog spears beneath the reeds and short bows inside their sleeves, and their oars knew how to be fingers when they needed to be. Arya did not bring a face. Jon was grateful and not. He had not expected the green men to greet them. They did not greet them. A ripple in the reed bed turned into a man with a mask of leaves and a cloak of living woven green twice the size of any Jon had ever seen, and then was not a man again. Jon felt indignation bloom in him that surprised him and made him feel foolish at the same time. Who was he to demand greeting from a thing that had not asked for his arrival? He lifted his oar in the way Desera had taught him, once, twice, again, and set it down. The ripple took that for what it was. A slow whisper went out through the reeds as if the lake itself had drawn back to listen. The Bound Star did not use banners. They came on 3 boats and a 4th, one heavy with casks that sat low in the water, the others riding higher and too sleek for riverboats. The men in them wore plain cloaks, plain boots. Each one had a ring on his finger, 7 plain bands of pewter, cheap but polished. The one in the stern of the first boat had a chain around his throat. It hung long down his chest under his cloak, but Jon could see it anyway. In the gray light that came before the sun, the links looked the same. He only knew they were not by the sad weight of the man's posture. The chain was heavy because it was the only weight the man had agreed to carry. A priest sat near him, his hair shorn to stubble, a 7-pointed star around his neck. He had an expression of bliss on his face that Jon did not like. There was another man in the second boat whose hood did not fall back. His hand looked too relaxed for someone sitting on a cask that could turn a river into an army of fire. If anyone had asked Jon what he feared most at that moment, he would have said, "Men who have forgotten that they are men." He would have said it calmly. He felt calm. Desera whispered once. Reed boats parted. Ghost slipped into the water and became part of it in that way he could, when no one but Jon would have believed he was there. Willem's son put an arrow through the priest's star and pinned it to his chest like an honorific. The man died with a smile still on his lips, which made Jon's gorge rise harder than the blood did. Hala's spear came up through the bottom mercilessly and found a knee. The Archmaester raised his hand as if calling a class to order. Jon put an arrow through it. The arrowhead punched into wood. The hand stayed where it was, pinned to the gunwale. The Archmaester's mouth moved. A word began. Arya's knife stopped it. The hooded man in the second boat moved as if he had been carved to do so. Fluid, without moral or meaning, the way a fish swims. Jon recognized the style in his bones. Arya moved in answer without thinking. Of course she had seen him coming before Jon had wanted to name it. When you know you fight your own reflection, you change the angle of attack. Arya did not mirror him. She interrupted. The first strike she threw made no sense, so it made all the sense. The hooded man stalled one heartbeat to reconsider the geometry of a fight he had already solved. It was enough. The boy behind Arya, who had no business at all being there and every business in the world, put the frog spear in the hooded man's leg and pinned him to the bench. He made a small sound Jon had never heard from a trained killer before. Surprise, real and human and offended. "Men make mistakes," Arya said in a voice that did not sound like hers or anyone's. "We are men." The hooded killer looked up at her with eyes that Jon had expected to be bottomless. They were only blue. He let go of something with his mouth, then maybe a prayer. It might have been a coin. Arya's blade had the shortest distance to travel to reach his throat. Arya chose not to travel that distance yet. She turned instead and put her knife into the bung of the nearest cask at an angle that made a Crannogman wince. The hole did not do what a hole should. It hissed angrily. A ribbon of green smoke escaped with a sound like laughter and then retreated back into the cask. "Now," Howland said, though he was nowhere near them, and every reed on the lake bent the same direction. Jon did not cut the ropes or loose the arrows he would have loosed. He put his hand on the cask and felt the hunger inside it like a living thing. He breathed like a tree. It was mad, stupid, even. The force inside wanted to burn his hand to bone and then burn the bone. He thought of Bran's strange new eyes and of the way a heartbeat feels beneath 1,000 tons of soil. He thought of his own name once, the one they had given him at the wall. He thought of how true it had been while it lasted. He thought of the men in these boats as men. Boys who had thought the chain would make them important, zealots who had thought the star would make them pure, killers who had thought the mask would make them free. He did not forgive them. He tried to see them. The cask's hunger found nothing to feed on in that. It hissed again. The hiss answered by a thin whine-off to starboard. Dessera's rope of lilies had wound itself around the second boat's oars without touching any oarsman's hands. The third boat's pilot was a man of sense. He had backed water as soon as Willem's son had loosed his arrow. He was turning for the reeds. He vanished, not by magic, by talent. There was a hole there none of them had seen. He found it. He took his boat into it, and the reeds closed behind him as if they had never been moved. "Let him," Howland said, far away, as if speaking inside Jon's ear. "He will tell a story. Stories travel." The Archmaester was staring at Jon in a way Jon did not like at all. It was like being put on a table. It made the muscles along his jaw knot. The pinned hand flexed against the arrow. The chain around his neck glinted, green as the light Uendi, or ice when a seal tips up to breathe. "What are you?" the man asked, and the question was so small at the core of so big a pride it made Jon sad for a second before rage washed through to clean the feeling out. "A man of the north," he said. He put his other hand on the cask. "Stop. You should not have obeyed." It was a thing designed to do the opposite of obedience. It was desire in a jar. It was a priest in a bottle. It did not obey, not truly, but it hesitated as if considering the possibility that the world had changed. That was enough for Dessera Reed to fling a wet cloth treated with a mud paste over the bunghole and press and seal and chant. It was enough for Halla to haul on the rope and tip 2 casks into the lake where they bobbed and moved as if living and then shuddered and stilled as the weight of the world's water taught them humility. It was enough for Arya to make a decision she had been making for years. She took the hooded killer's face and folded it back. She did not put it on. The man looked up at her, bare and human. You do not stay human over long in the house that taught Arya what she had learned. That was its point. Jon watched his sister spare the man the worst of the house's lesson a second time. She did it without lecturing the man and without pity. She did it because she had chosen who to be. She said to him and to the chain and to the star and to the old lips around the lake. No, it was not a big word. It broke something. The man who had been hidden snarled like a boy losing a game. He twisted and the frog spear in his leg tore flesh. He grinned at the pain, almost grateful for it. He moved the way queasy men move when the ship begins to roll. He tried to throw himself onto a cask. He did not reach it. Willem's son's second arrow clipped him in the shoulder and became bone. He slumped. He did not die. Not yet. The Archmaester yanked his hand off Jon's arrow and left a strip of skin behind. He tried to reach for the chain as if it were a talisman. Jon kicked him in the chest and put him on his back. The boat shifted. Water licked in. "Don't," Jon said, and heard his own voice as if through slush. "Do you know what you are doing?" The Archmaester gasped, outraged that anyone could kick him on a river. "You are letting folly reign. Men who fear their shadows will light candles in every corner of the world until the world itself is on fire. We are men who know how to blow them out. You are men who would burn a forest to put out a hearth," Jon said. "Tie him." They tied him. They tied the killer. They left the priest for the fishes. They pushed 2 boats heavy with dampened green death into the reeds, and the reeds received them. The green men did not step out to take their prisoners. They sent a ripple of quiet outward that told the lake what had happened, that the fires had been stayed and the faces would not burn tonight. That was ceremony enough. On the 3rd day after they had burned the black boat, Bran sent them a whisper Jon did not want to hear. It rode on the back of a bird's call and stabbed. He knew at once what the pain meant. Emergency. Winterfell. Sansa had never liked secrets. She understood them. She did not like them. She had let Jon and Arya and Bran make a new kind of secret because the alternative was letting other men burn her gods. She had done it with a clean face and clean hands. Men who led with clean hands sometimes drew knives with clean hands too. Jon's blood went cold and then warm and then very, very quiet. That quiet held an image. The Merman's court as seen through holes bored in a wall. A man wearing a face that was Lord Wyman's but carried a shadow wrong under his ear. A forged letter in Sansa's hand bearing a seal that had never been melted. The bound star had let part of their plan burn on God's eye on purpose. They had sent the rest north. "They're in Winterfell," Jon said. "Or they will be." Arya's mouth went flat in a way Jon had seen only when she had been 10 and had waited in a stable until every boy in the yard had forgotten she was there, then had hit one of them so hard he had swallowed teeth. "Then we'll arrive before whoever they sent," she said, as if that were something one could decide. They ran and then they rode. Desera Reed found them a kelp-boned horse that had learned how to breathe water. Halla stole a boat with low draft and a stubborn rudder. Willem's son called in a favor he had with a farmer north of Seven Streams who had a pair of nags with legs like wind. The boy disappeared from camp and returned with a string of ponies and hands that smelled of hay. The Manderly cousin wheezed and smiled like a man being tickled by a ghost. When they came to the King's Road, Jon had to remind himself that this was the same road he had ridden once to the wall with a belly full of promises and snow in his hair and the kind of fear that was almost excitement. At dawn on the 4th day, Jon saw Winterfell rise out of the white like a ship coming out of mist. He did not feel relief. He felt the sense a man feels when he is about to walk into a room where he knows a trap has been set precisely for him. He told himself to beware glory. He told himself to fear tidy answers. He told himself his sister would not thank him for a hero. She would require a solution. "Sansa will have noticed," Arya said, as if reading the thoughts he had left out loud on a table. "Sansa notices everything," Jon said. "I do not know if that's true," Arya said, surprising him. "I think maybe she chooses what to notice." Then she smiled thinly. "She has learned to choose well." They did not go through the gate like men returning from a hunt. They went around. Halla scaled a wall men said could not be scaled and dropped a rope of braided horsehair into a shadow. Willem's son walked along a ledge of stone that had been worn smooth by the feet of no one at all. The boy did what boys do who were born with a gift for mischief and mad. He serious by war. He went where he pleased. Desera Reed became a hummock no one would step on and slid across the dry moat like a shadow of water. Arya did not need any of these tricks. She walked in as a washerwoman with her head down and her shoulders tired and a basket on her back full of nothing, because she had learned that people do not see you when you do work for them. Jon wore a face. He had told himself he would not. He had told himself he was himself and that should be enough. He had told himself he could do any of this as Jon Snow. It might have been true. It also might have been stubbornness, and stubbornness got you dead if you married it to pride. Arya had opened her bundle quiet as always. She had looked at him with no judgment. He had taken the face and he had pressed it to his own. It had felt like ice dipped in hot water and pressed the skin until it becomes merely water. Shocking, then merely there. He had looked into the pool in the Godswood and seen a man he did not know looking back. A clean-shaven Sellsword with a scar under his lip and a sleepy expression men liked to underestimate. The man had a name that was forgettable. The guards at the postern gate did not blink when he passed them with a sack of potatoes over his shoulder. He went first to the kitchens because poison lives there. He watched with the eyes he had borrowed, eyes that had looked at women carrying water and seen only their hips. He saw a young girl with a freckled nose watch him and then look away because she did not want to please him. He saw a pot of soup with the color of bile. He saw old Nan's granddaughter stirring with a wooden spoon that had a notch. He looked at the notch and knew what had made it. A mouth with a bad tooth. He did not see what he expected to see. A man with a chain or a star or a hood. He saw a woman he had never seen. Tall, plain, with hair scraped back and eyes that did not belong in a kitchen when they looked at him. She smiled without moving her mouth. Then she turned away and picked up a jug and carried it through the side door to the little dining chamber Sansa used when she ate alone. He followed because he had learned that the best way to follow is to be the man who belongs in a space. He was exactly the man now who would deliver potatoes to a corner and scrape his boot and leave. He entered the small room just as the woman set the jug down and bent a little too low, to hide her face a little too much. Sansa sat at the table with a half-eaten trencher of something bran heavy and no one else beside her. She put her hand out toward the jug without looking at the woman. Jon saw the woman's fingers on the handle whitening, as if they were too tight. He had seen too many deaths not to know that look. The look of a hand that thinks it is about to do something irreparable and is eager for it to be finished. He breathed like a tree, and the tree breathed back. He moved the way Arya had taught him to move when movement had to be weightless. He became the shadow of a thought. He crossed the space between the door and his sister while the woman's hand made a white print on glazed clay. He reached out and touched the jug at the same time as Sansa's fingers did. Their fingers brushed lightly. He smelled almond and something latticed over it like deceit. "Forgive me, my lady," he said, in the accent of the man whose face he wore. "The lady from the cellars told me to fetch the fine wine. I brought the small. I've brought the wrong one." Sansa looked up. Her eyes did not show surprise. Jon watched her recognize him without letting any of it exist on her face. He had always been proud of her. It was a fresh feeling to be proud of her because she was going to outplay him. "Set it down," Sansa said. "Then fetch the other." Her voice was as bland as porridge, as sweet as cream poured on it. The woman with the jug had realized the problem with the same speed as Sansa. She tensed to move. Jon put a hand on her wrist. The wrist was thinner than the arm implied. She tried to jerk free. Sansa's hand had found and gripped something under the table. Jon did not look down to see the small knife she would have put there without fanfare. He did not need to. Arya came through the pantry door with her basket of nothing like a winter gust that finds a crack and learns from it where the entire wall is weakest. She did not make a noise. She closed the door behind herself. She looked at the woman with the jug and smiled a smile that had no face in it. The woman with the jug did not falter. She had trained too long for that. She tipped the jug. Sansa did not drink. She did not scream. She did not fling the jug's contents or toss the table. She put the knife in the woman's thigh and turned it. The woman gasped, still barely making a noise. Arya took the jug, gently, with two hands as if it were the first winter's wine. Jon took Sansa's hand. They held a moment. That was all. The woman slid down the wall into a squat and laughed once, surprising herself. The laugh had the language of bravos in it and something else. It was flat and hopeless. "I thought," she said, mourning, "that I could do this. I thought I could be no one here, but you pulled me toward names." "You were no one there," Arya said, steady. "Here we have plenty of someones." She set the jug on the table and pushed it away from Sansa with a finger as delicate as a lady's. "Leave. The woman looked up at her, too confused to understand the order. "Leave, leave," Arya said. "You can poison yourself in the yard if you want to keep to your gods. Or you can run. But you will not poison my sister. You will not burn my tree. Choose." "You cannot let her go," Willem's son said from the door he had not used. Jon did not jump. He had expected Willem. "She will return. She will bring others. She will think about this," Arya said, which was not the same as mercy. Her voice was cold and not sorry. "Men think about what works. She will tell someone the North is full of things that are expensive to kill. She will tell someone the North spared her," Sansa murmured. "That is a story I prefer." The woman stared at the three of them as if she had never seen three people in a room together before. Then she made a decision that took all the strength she had left. She set her hand on the knife in her thigh and pulled it out by half its length. She hissed as she did. The hiss had relief in it, and then a welling fear when the blood came. She looked at Arya a moment longer. Emotion moved across her face like sunlight under fast clouds. It struck Jon then, not with pity, with clarity, that this woman had been offered no choices for a very long time. The only choice she had been offered was whether to become less than she was. He felt anger like tears behind his eyes. He had no more interest in making men small than he did in setting the world alight to keep it safe. "Go," he said. She went. She left a smear of blood and almond scent on the door latch. It would not take her long to die in the yard or far from it. If she chose to live, she would have something with her on the path the house did not give. A memory of not dying when someone meant her to. Jon did not have to forgive her. That was not his work. His work was making sure there was a path to walk. They were not done. They were never done. The bound star had other knives. One arrived in the shape of a letter with a broken wax seal and an invitation to a feast at White Harbor to celebrate the founding of a new sept there. It was stamped with Wyman Manderly's sigil and a neat subscript thanking Sansa for her aid in construction, which aid had never been given. Another came lashed to a raven's leg with a black ribbon, asking for the presence of a Stark at the Citadel to receive the apology of an Archmaester for misunderstandings. Sansa made a neat stack of such invitations and then put them into the fire a page at a time, watching each curl. "I will not be summoned to my own hearth," she said, when Jon asked with his eyes if perhaps they should go. "We will choose where to be." They chose to be where their enemies were next. "How do you beat men who live in books?" Arya asked Jon when they were preparing to leave by night. She was fastening a face Jon had not seen before. A woman with a mole like a softened raindrop above her lip. It made her look like no one, which was the point. "You don't," Jon said. "You take their books." He was not a clever man by the measure of men who wrote glossaries for glossaries. But he had lived among men who make plans and fail and make more plans and fail and then stop making plans and die. He knew that the way to win sometimes was to ask the question that sat under the room. Not who or how or when, but why here? Why Old Town? Why White Harbor? Why the Isle? Why the Neck? Why now? Bran answered without being asked. "Because they are afraid," he said simply. They were in the Godswood again. They were there at dusk as they had been once before. The heart tree's face looked at them with no malice at all. When Jon leaned his head against it, he could feel the low thrum of life as he had, but he could also feel the burned places like scars in flesh. He had not been able to feel that before. He wondered if he had learned or if the scars had grown. He was not sure which answer made him feel less well. "Of what?" Arya said, repeating Hala's question, though Hala was not there to hear that old echo. "Of the world refusing to be small," Bran said. He tilted his head. His eyes were farther away than days had any right to call a man. "Of the North remembering itself. Of trees whispering again. Of wolves that do not ask men for permission to run." "You," Arya said, and there was not kindness in it. Bran smiled without offense. "Me," he said, "and you, and him." He touched Ghost's head and Ghost did not move away. "And Sansa, and the green men, and the reeds for that matter." His gaze turned toward the south without turning. Also the dragons men talk about at supper and do not believe in when they go to sleep. They are afraid of all of us and any of us at once. How do you stop men from being afraid? Jon asked. You don't, Bran said. You teach them the right things to fear. And you make the wrong things expensive. That was what they did. They did not storm the citadel. It would have been folly and perhaps the end of too many old books for Jon to bear. They stole from it. The glass candle the Archmaester had set in a cup and burned his hand with sat in a locked room behind a locked door behind a stair guarded by a boy who had been told precisely what to look at and had chosen to admire his own sense of importance instead. Arya put a face on at the bottom of the stair and took it off at the top. Jon held a key he had not held when he had begun to climb. He had not realized he could do that until he could. Ghost stood in the alley and made men keep walking. Dessera Reed had a trick with a reed and a rat that would have been funny if it had not also been cruel. Willem's son studied the lock as if it had built the world and decided that lock had still managed to do it incorrectly. The door opened. The glass candle was not green when they took it. It had learned to be clear again. Jon held it and could see his own face in it and the face he wore as well. That made his stomach turn. He handed it to the boy and made a sound in his throat that was almost a laugh. If it breaks, he said, tell Sansa I will pay. They took other things. A ledger, because men who loved order always kept one. A chain link made of a metal Jon could not name, because he suspected naming it would make his tongue hurt. A thin book bound in a tanner's heaven with careful, precise hand, titled The Right Ordering of the Known Realm's Divinities, which made Arya snort so loudly Willem's son had to clap his hand over her mouth. They left other things where they were. They did not want to be destroyers. They wanted to be thieves whose thieving saved. They did not go by sea. They went by a road at the end of a canal that no man took at night unless he was tired of his life. They were not tired. They were very awake. They left a note on the locked door, and that was Arya's idea, and Jon liked it because it felt like a kind of knife that cut men where they guarded themselves least. It read, "We borrowed what you were not using. We will return it when you can promise to keep it safe." The signature was a leaf. When the Archmaester with the chain around his neck saw it 2 mornings later, the small man who brought him his bread swore he saw smoke curl from the man's ears. No one believed him. Everyone enjoyed it. They went next where men were listening very hard for them. White Harbor, where the bound star had begun in earnest. Knights in plain rings visiting the small folk and promising a new kind of prayer that would not ask men to kneel to trees or to lords. Sansa moved quietly by herself a day later to undo the knots they tied, with words where Jon would have used steel. She went to the market square and turned in a circle and told the gathered crowd what had happened to a god who had never been theirs. The Isle saved, the Archmaester bound, the wildfire drowned. She did not tell them who had done it. She told them that she had asked it be done, and that a lady of Winterfell would always ask such things to be done wherever men tried to unmake the North. Men and women listened and then made up their minds and then went home to dine. Men and women are very good at that. Sansa knew it. She arranged the supper. She made the merman nod. She made the Septon, who had not been consulted by the bound star, look quietly delighted. She looked at many men, through them, past them. The story she told made other stories very expensive to tell. The bound star was not merely a faith. It was a purse. They starved it. They followed coin. They cut strings and returned bags to the men who had filled them with a note inside. This bought a kind of fire that burns too far. Your coin is not clean of it. Buy cattle instead. The notes were not threats. They were receipts. Men who do not want it happen to me news in their accounts learn quickly how to purchase other things. A lord in the Riverlands named Strickland forgot to read the note and tried to hire men for a march north. His men heard of it before he could shout. He drank alone that night and the next. On the 3rd night he got religion and gave it up. Men who had watched him shouted. Then they apologized to Sansa. She accepted the apology with her hands clasped and her eyes open. The Archmaester did not stay bound. He had too many friends with too many keys. He returned to his spine chair and his small, petty power and his chain that made him hunch. He took the lesson he had been given and did as men like him did. Called it coincidence. He failed to believe. That saved him. Men who do not believe in the knives hunting them are easier to stay ahead of. It told Jon something else as well. This would not end. The North had always been too big and too old for one spring to wash it clean. The knife had to be kept, oiled and out of sight. The eye had to be kept open. The old gods would always be old. The ones who feared them would always be learning new ways to be afraid. They were not a company with a name. The men around Jon called themselves No Thing and liked it. Fate has a way of naming men anyway. In the village between White Harbor and Winterfell, a girl who had watched a woman with a mole above her lip take a jug from her mother's hands and send her mother to bed before she dropped it and died called Jon's group the Quiet Wolves because they made as little noise as the wind before a thaw does. The name stuck where names do. Jon never used it. He did not forbid it. Sansa used it carefully when it would do a thing and did not when it would do another. Bran trained him in the Godswood until the sight came without the pain of return. Until Jon could close his eyes and find the road a man had taken by the way the elm made a different sound to the wind that day. Until Jon could count ravens not by their bodies but by the manner of their thoughts, hungry, amused, shy. Until Ghost and he did not need to speak to be in the same place. It did not make him a seer. It made him more himself in the places where himself had already begun to grow. Arya trained him in ways that were less forgiving. He walked the winter town without being seen by men who had known him since he was a boy. He learned the step that produced no sound and the breath that produced no steam when it mattered. He learned to listen to the lie of a room. Letters that should be askew and sat square. Jugs that should be half full and were full to brimming. Chairs pulled out half an inch too far. He learned to tilt his head so that the image in a cup told him who was behind him instead of showing him his own nose. He put faces on twice more and took them off twice with relief and twice with reluctance. He kept his own face as he would keep a blade that had never let him down. He learned to be mistrustful of becoming good at being someone else. They found the priest who had written the Bound Stars Manifesto, a dry, trembling man with the conviction of unkissed lips, in a town where men had names for the gods that were too old to write, and Arya sat in his pew dressed as a pilgrim and asked a kind question. The man talked himself stupid. He wept when she thanked him. He said he had not known that someone could ask him to stop so politely. She said nothing to that. She went to the graveyard behind the sept when he had gone to bed and ran her fingers over the names there. She said sorry to 3 of them. Jon never asked why. He thought he knew. It would have been a story easy to love if it had ended on a hill with dawn coming and a boy with a spear. Finally sleeping for the first time in 3 nights. But there were still men too hungry for smallness. There were still women who wanted to know where their sons had gone and would never get the answer they wanted. There were still casks anywhere casks could be filled. There were still books that did not understand the curve of a winter that went on one day too long. They came to the very edge of ending once, and only once, as far as Jon would admit aloud. It was not at the Citadel or the Merman's Court or on God's Eye. It was in a miner's camp in the hills west of Last Hearth. The Bound Star, beaten in the south, had come north with a different plan. Burn what was small and quiet instead of what was big and loud. The camp had a small shrine, because men who dig the earth like to thank it and ask it to not fall in on them. The Bound Star had lured a boy there and asked him to hold a lamp for them while they prayed. The boy held the lamp. The earth did not take him. The lamp spilled. By the time Jon and Arya and their few arrived, one wall of the mine was a black tooth in the afternoon light and the men were out of water. Jon went down. There was nothing to see. There was everything to feel. He felt heat like hands. He felt stone complaining in a language no man should want to know. He felt the long suck of air that comes before a roof fails. He staggered when the floor did not, and caught himself on a timber that had been set 2 years ago by a man who had done the work because his son was born and needed an extra blanket. He found the boy with the lamp and he found the Bound Star man who had told him to hold it. The boy had a look on his face Jon had seen in his own mirror. Shame you do not deserve that is trying to make a home under your skin. The Bound Star man had a faith you could break with a hammer and it would turn to 2 smaller faiths. Jon took him by the face and put his forehead to his and pressed, as Bran had taught him to press a cask with his hand. He did not tell the man he forgave him. He told him a thing he did not believe in, You will die if you stay, and you deserve to. He backed it with another thing the man believed. I will die with you if you make me. Then he moved and moved the boy and moved the next man behind them, and above them he heard a voice that was the world's, and below that he heard Arya's voice telling him they did not have time, and below that he heard something that was neither, his own voice, a thing he had not always liked, saying, "Step, step, step." They came out of that breathing coal. After, he sat with the boy and he did not speak for a long time. Then he told the boy a story about a night watchman who had once failed to close a gate and how he had gone on watching nights anyway. The boy's face did not lift. It did not need to. Sansa found Jon later that evening and said the thing she had learned to say when she was a girl, and it had saved her more than any knife. Thank you. It was a thing she had discovered in a place where a man in a crown did what he pleased. For the mine, she added, because she knew it mattered. For the rest. For keeping your face when you could have borrowed one. He thought about telling her then. About the truth that had been given him in a tower that had not been in his childhood. About what his blood had made him and what his snow had made him and what the trees had taught him. He had thought, years ago, that telling the truth would set him free because men say that when they feel clever. He had learned that truths are stones you carry or put down, and sometimes putting them down knocks a house flat. He did not tell her. He took her hand. He had never liked to ask for anything he could not repay. He asked for nothing. "We made something," she said, and he saw that her eyes were tired and bright. Not a thing Father would have chosen, maybe. Not a thing Robb would have believed in. But a thing that fits in this world and does not break it to fit it. Her mouth twitched. "That is all I want to do. Make the world fit where I live." "It fits over you well," he said, "because sometimes honesty is a comfort, and sometimes comfort is the honesty most worth giving." He walked after to the Godswood, because a man who has learned to breathe like a tree must check that he still can. Bran was there, of course. Bran was nearly always there now, even when he was not. It had not made him a stranger. It had made him himself, which was worse and better both. "You could learn more," Bran said, when Jon closed his eyes and felt the sap take him and let him go. "You could look farther. You could become one of us." He stopped and smiled at his own mistake. "One of them. I am a man," Jon said without apology. "You are," Bran said, "and a wolf and snow and a tree when you stand here, and other things when you stand elsewhere. We are all many things when we let ourselves be." "Do you mind if I don't?" Jon asked. Bran's laugh was the sound of a leaf going from green to red. "No," he said. "You're doing well enough." Arya slid into the clearing then, not bothering to be unseen because it was dark and there was no need. She had a cat on her shoulder. It was unhappy about the snow and delighted by Arya's ear. She stroked its chin and let it bite her finger and laughed when it did. She had not laughed like that in some time. She had a knife in her other hand and did not put it away. She would never put it away. Jon did not ask her to. He did not want a world where he would ask her to do that. "Are we done?" she asked. "No," Jon and Bran said together. "Good," Arya said, and grinned like dawn. "I'm not done either." They would not set down their knives. They would not leave the glass candle in a complacent man's hands to make penitence with. They would not wait for a letter that was polite and promised to hurt no one they loved. They would not let someone else name their work and call it something that felt better in the mouth. He would be one of those men who had learned at last, by cost and the ache of his own failures, that there are better ways to be safe than to burn what frightens you. That is a harder learning than most men ever manage. Jon would not thank him. He would let him go. That would be thanks enough. The heart tree would keep whispering. That was what it did. It had watched kings and boys and men in black and girls with knives and little gods with big books, and it had not stopped being a tree. It would not stop. It would drink. It would let creatures live in it and on it and under it. It would gossip about the wind. It would make shade for those who would ask for it and those who would not. It would count the ravens it liked and refuse to count the ones it did not. On a night when the stars were thick as a sieve, Jon would place his forehead against its bark and say no words at all. He would breathe as it breathed. In the breath would be the boy in the mines and the woman with a jug and the Archmaester's hand stuck to a boat. In the breath would be Sansa's clean fingers, Arya's cat, Bran's long, deep look. In the breath would be the North, which had always been bigger than any one of them could hold. In the breath would be all the faces they had not worn. In the breath would be all the faces they had saved. He would leave his own there as if leaving a coin, and the tree would keep it for him for when he forgot it. The old gods forgave in that way. They were not men. They were not the house. They did not expect coin. They expected attendance and presence and patience. Jon had learned to give those. He would go on giving them. When the next trouble came, he would know it by the taste in the air before the raven carried a letter over the yard with a broken seal. There would be another boat with a name like an irony, and there would be another faction with a title like a sermon. There would be shoulders to stand behind and a gate to leave open on purpose and a knife to stay sheathed because killing is not always the point. There would be another coin turned over in his palm that would not buy what the man who gave it hoped it would purchase. There would be a little boy with a reed flute and a tune that could remind a woman why she had not died. There would be a crannogman who taught a lord how to walk in mud. There would be winters. There would be thaws. There would be old books that stopped pretending to know everything and learned, at last, to ask. Arya would say, in a hall with a ceiling that had learned again how to shelter and a floor where men had danced poorly. We were good at it not ending then. She would have a new scar by then and a new story she would not tell unless Jon wore a face he had never worn before to hear it. He would decline, and she would laugh and tell it anyway. Bran would tilt his head and say something no one could argue with and no one really understood, and they would all refuse to worry about that because it took worry to places where it could not be fed. Sansa would read a letter from a man in the south who had once sent money north to melt gods and now sent a gift of beskeps carved with leaves. She would gift them to a village that had rebuilt a god's wood out of saplings and patience. She would sleep well that night. She would wake to snow and not despair. The wolves would run. The trees would learn all their names. The men who hated masks would discover their own faces. The women who had waited too long to be themselves would open their hands and let go of the thing they had held lest it be a knife. The priests would find their prayers did not work on men who preferred actions to incantations. The archmasters would keep pinning lost bits of the world to pages and swear they had always been there. It would be fine. In the event that men came again with chains and cleverness and faith bound together into a knot each one thought would hold, the North would have its own knot. It would look like reeds twisted by a patient hand. It would look like a wolf so white it was snow standing in snow. It would look like a girl take a bad haircut and a knife and a cat. It would look like a man with a face he kept on because it was true. It would look like a queen warmed by a fire she had set in the right place at the right time. It would look like a boy whose eyes had become old as rivers and still looked with love on his brother and sister and the men who called them Lord. They would do what they were born for. They would do what they had been taught. They would make the wrong things expensive and the right things possible. They would wait where waiting mattered and move where it did not. They would go on. They would go on.